Okay, good evening, everybody. And it's my pleasure to honor to welcome you here to for this event. Rav Sobel, who was supposed to introduce the evening, has been called away. And hopefully he'll join us in the middle and he'll be able to say a few words. But I've been recently given the task of opening the evening up as well. So we're all here to not only mark the Hashkat Sefer, the book launch of the last Hasid, or Shapat's book in English, which came out 4 years ago in Hebrew, 5 years ago in Hebrew. For those of us who were privileged to be at the Hashkat Sefer, the book launch in Hebrew a number of years ago, it doesn't seem like 5 years ago, but not only are we here to mark the publication of the book in English, we're also here to talk about testimony and memory and gvura of the Holocaust as we wind down our commemoration this year of Yom HaShoah. I think it's a very appropriate topic and venue, so welcome to everybody. I don't think that Rav Shachar needs much introduction here at all, but just in case, Rav Shachar is the Rav of Kivat Meir Modi'in, and he has been there for 7 years. He's also a Ram at the Yeshivat Hesder in Modi'in. And for those, some of you know that Rav Sobel and I run a program called Barkai, which trains Rabbanim in practical rabbinics, and we've graduated around close to 90 Rabbanim over the last 10 years, and Rav Shachar is one of the star Barkai graduates, who he and his wife Renana are doing God's work in Modi'in and across Israel. And we're very honored to have him here and to have this event here this evening. I'll be back later, but for now I call upon Rav Shachar Kihan.
Good evening. Maybe it's not appropriate to begin with good evening just after the end of the Holocaust Remembrance Day. But as my grandfather and teacher used to say, if we are all here, then we can say it is a good evening. This evening brings together 3 communities in Modi'in with many English speakers, Sha'arei Yona Menachem, Darkei Tzion, and Meir Modi'in, is focused on one of the most unique and special ways we document and memorialize the Holocaust. A few days ago, someone who had read my book in Hebrew called me from Itamar settlement and told me that they also wrote a book about their grandmother and how difficult and complex it was to write about the Holocaust, and how that generation is continuing to disappear. Today, the memory of the Holocaust is found in those books. And it is our duty to publish more and more such stories in order to ensure the message is passed down. I spent over 20 years interviewing my grandfather and recording him, collecting materials, and trying to understand what exactly happened there in that other world. My grandfather's stories are much more than a personal or family history. Of course, everything is written in his language and from his point of view, but it is also a larger story of the Jewish people over the past 100 years. Sabbath seems to have been present at many significant historical events, which allows us to see the story of the entire nation through the lens of his personal experience. It begins with Saba's close relationship with the Rebbe of Piaseczna and his presence at his famous ceremonies, through the meeting with Romkovsky and the famous children's action, Aktiat HaYiladim, in the lodge ghetto, and meeting with Mengele, and even being there when the Mufti of Jerusalem arrived at the gates of Auschwitz to see how the Jews were being exterminated. It continues with his work in the camps near the construction of Hitler's bunker as part of the Riese project, and ends with his aliyah to Israel on board of famous illegal immigrant ship Beria, with its miraculous journey to the shores of Israel. And all is written in the book. There is a key question that every person asks himself when talking about the Holocaust. Where was God in the Holocaust? Sada had a very simple answer to this. Where was God in the Holocaust? Where was God in the Holocaust? I saw him everywhere and in every corner, in all the situations when I was hanging between life and death. There he was. Saba was a great man of faith who felt God everywhere and instilled his faith in everyone he met. Through this book, one can see Saba's special character as a great man of faith from whom one can learn what faith in God really is. We encounter the unique point of view of someone who went through unbearable things and even so never stopped believing for a moment. And we can certainly learn a lot from his perspective for our own life. With all the difficulties and complex realities we experience. All his life, Saba made an effort to instill his faith in others. In sharing this book with the public, and that's the reason we translate it too, I feel that Saba continues to be meaningful and relevant even to people who never got to know him personally. In a sense, it was probably not a coincidence that he has called Saba Israel. I would like to say some things now. The translator, first of all, Sarah Magen, she's here, that translates the book, who did an outstanding job. We specifically choose someone with a Jewish Hasidic orientation. Okay. And she indeed understood our intentions very well. The book does not seem like a translation at all. This is what people who have read the book say. So Burovitz, a good friend who went through the whole book several times, sat with us for hours and contributed his ways, observations. Fegestein מקווי מתאר for the layout and design of the cover. Zeev Alexander, who financially assisted in publishing the book. My father, my father and teacher, for pushing and encouraging me to write Sabbath's memoir, his father's memoir, and for joining me on a journey to Poland in my grandfather's footsteps. 7 years ago, we went together to Poland, 1,700 kilometers he drive in 4 days, according to my
calculation.
And of course, my mother and teacher, for her hard work, her comment, directions, edits and deletions, more edits and more deletions, copy editing and proofing, and for working literally day and night around the clock, producing the entire English edition for the book. And of course, my dear wife, Renana, for all the advice and insights and for the time she gave me to dedicate to this book. And all the English speaking friends who assisted us with comment on the book. And the Meir, Harael for the assistance putting this evening together. Thank you very much, Hatan. And the Barkai organization for the training and empowerment of communal rabbis. Rabbi Shlomo Sobol, that's supposed to come, and Rabbi David Fine, thank you very much. And to everyone else who provided assistance of any kind, and I failed of mention their name, thank you. Before I introduce the next lecture, I'd like to tell you why I call the book The Last Chassid. One of the most famous rabbis in the context of the Holocaust is the Rebbe of the Ascension. The Rebbe wrote many books, the most famous of which is Esh Kodesh, which was written inside the Warsaw ghetto during the Holocaust and was buried under the foundations of one of the houses, with writing were miraculously discovered and became a powerful spiritual record for that period. Saba really was one of the last of the Hasidim who had the opportunity to be in the presence of the rabbi before the war. Saba was deeply connected to the Rebbe. At every crossroad he met throughout his life, he always asked himself, what would the Rebbe do? What would the Rebbe act? Now, I would like to invite my friend, Zach Levi, educator and Poland guide for J. Root, to speak about Warsaw, where the Rebbe of the Ascension was in the ghetto, and the secret archive. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rav Shachar, and everyone for the opportunity. My training is in B'nai Akiva, so I'm going to do something very uncomfortable. If you're okay and you're at the back and you want to come a little bit closer, you're welcome, because there might be an interactive bit that we might need you to talk. If you're right at the back, you're welcome to join. No, Rav Shachar's leading. Okay. See if we can, if the technology will work. Oh, fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity, Rav Shachar. Really, 5 years ago, when the book was launched in Hebrew, I was lucky enough to be there and to pick up my copy and struggle through it in my Olech Hadash, with my Olech Hadash Hebrew, and realized that the story of the last Chassid was exceptional. And for me, going to Poland regularly and trying to teach people about the Jewish world and Jewish life before the war and Jewish life during the war and Jewish life after the war it became a tool, and when we passed it around our sort of group of educators, everyone wanted to read it, so much so Rav Shachar came to, during Corona, came to speak to our team of educators to say, like, give everyone an insight into who this man was. Because as Rav Shachar said, the Rebbe of Piatzetzna, Rav Kalonimus Kalman Shapira, the Eish Kodesh, whichever title you want to give him, he looms very large when you talk about the Shoah and when you talk about Warsaw. And he looms large in the title of the book. He's there on the cover, and you can't be the last Chassid without there being a Rebbe. Yeah, a Rebbe with no Chassidim or a Chassid with no Rebbe. It doesn't quite work. And I think that he is I would say, like, the context for what I want to do over the next, I think, sort of half an hour that we have together to delve a little bit into Warsaw. As we come to the end of Yom HaShoah, we know that Yom HaShoah was sort of put here because of its connection to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's an awkward date. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started on Erev Pesach. The secularists wanted Yom HaShoah to be on Erev Pesach, which would have surely done away with Seder night. In the end, sort of the agreement was it sort of sits here just after Pesach, so anybody who works in Holocaust education has a rush just after Pesach to get everything ready for Yom HaShoah. It's like the opposite of what normal people do for Pesach. And this is where it sits. So I think it's worthwhile understanding a little bit of Warsaw, and through there, I think we're going to end up back at the Eish Kodesh, back at the Rebbe of Piatzetzna. And sometimes I think people assume that the Rebbe of Piatzetzna became big or became a thing because of the Holocaust. As in, he happened to be the guy who was still teaching inside the Warsaw Ghetto. He happened to be the guy who was teaching inside the Warsaw Ghetto and managed to write down his writings, and they managed to be preserved. So those circumstances made him the person that we know of. I think if you would have paused Jewish history in 1939 before the Shoah, you would still have met the Rebbe of Piatzetzna, and you would have met a giant. Because when you read the book, you will see that his focus was very much on the youth. The world was changing, the Jewish world was changing, and the Rebbe of Piatzetzna knew that. And the way that he engaged with his students and with young people with their peyot and people not with their peyot, was sort of light years ahead of its time. And I think what he did was he applied Chassidut, the real like foundations of it, this idea of like a love for every Jew, this idea of the individual potential of every person, and he put that into educational philosophy. And the idea that a Hasidic Rebbe is talking about educational philosophy sounds very, very modern, but that's exactly what he was doing. And I think that is going to be, together with all the circumstances that mean that we have his writings and we can sort of have an insight into who he was, and through the survivors who knew him, they became like the cliché of like the second, like one step removed of who these people were. So I want to try and do a little bit about have a look a little bit about Warsaw and the secret archive, which is the context of how the writings of the Rebbe survived. Okay. All right. So just never take anything for granted. That's sort of where we're looking. Poland is in the middle of Europe. It sits between Russia and Germany. If you're looking at the news today, you'll also see it. And Warsaw is its capital. It's far too small to look at the moment. But if you go to Warsaw today and you want to explore Jewish life, you'll have a very, very hard time, because there's a cemetery and there's some memorials. And if you want to go to the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, you'll go here. Okay, this is the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, or better still, this was the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, the site of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, and this is what it looked like. And this is a beautiful shul that we're in. But this made this look like a shtibel, as in the hundreds of Batei Knesset and shtibelach and all of the types of klois and the types of Jewish life in Warsaw. It dwarfs anything that we're familiar with. Warsaw was the second largest Jewish community in the world at the time. On the eve of the war, was the biggest Jewish community in Europe. The only Jewish community bigger in the entire world was New York. Okay, exactly, New York. And bear in mind that even though the Jews of New York thought that they were in the Golden Medina, there was backwards and forwards. There's a lot of travel of people coming from New York to Warsaw to do business, to see culture, to learn Torah, all of these types of things. We think of it as like a one-way ticket. Once you're out of Europe, you're out of Europe. That's what the only way people went. People came from New York to Warsaw in order to soak up the atmosphere of Jewish life there, a city where 1 in 3 people was Jewish. Okay, and that is going to set the tone, the pulse of the place is going to be a Jewish pulse. The Gentiles of Warsaw will understand what day of the week it is. They will understand what Chag is coming, what Chag has been, in the same way that any non-Jew living in Israel feels the sense of the place. Now, if you sometimes when we imagine the Jews of Warsaw or the Jews of Europe generally, and I think this is a challenge that all of us have, especially on the eve of Yom HaShoah, we're thinking about the Shoah. The victims of the Shoah, who were they? And very often this is our guy, or it's his cousin, or it's his brother, and it would be fair to say that Jews in Europe looked like this, because some Jews in Europe look like this. I can guarantee you that 51% of Jews certainly didn't look like this, because they would have had trouble growing a beard, because yes, the Jewish community was made up of men and women, okay, equally. But even the gender difference, okay, so you take it back that actually the world's a little bit more diverse. The Orthodox Jews of Poland, for instance, if you just draw the circle there, you're talking maybe about 30%. Which means that those of us who come from Putzlarex, who lived in Jewish communities, which were diverse, which had Orthodox people and Reformed people, and so all of those, again, even if the labels didn't exist then, the sort of the tapestry of Jewish life was the same as the tapestry of Jewish life that we're probably much more familiar with. So sometimes we have to take off our, I would say rose tinted glasses, but black and white tinted glasses that sort of puts people in the same place looking the same, for two reasons. Number one, because truth is important. If you're going to know something, you should know the truth. But the other thing is that I think that many of us look at someone and a picture like this, and it feels very distant. It feels like something that does belong to another era. And it's not like that. You know what? We live around the corner from many people who dress like this. They're part of our society. We might not dress like that. We might not look like that, and that's okay. But when it comes to dealing with the Shoah, sometimes that creates a disconnect, I would say, in terms of our empathy for what we're dealing with when we're talking about the Shoah. And that's why I'm a big fan of this photo, because I was sitting in my office one time a few years ago, and someone came in. When people know you deal with Holocaust education, they love to talk about their parents and their grandparents. Okay, they can't wait to get there. It's like being a doctor and someone telling their medical problems. Yeah, they tell you where their grandparents from. This guy comes, he says, my grandfather was from Warsaw. He starts talking about Warsaw, and then he pulls out this picture, and he says, and this is a picture of my grandfather. And it's one of them on the three on the right, and I can still never remember which one it is. What was his job? He was a clown, okay, and he says to me, he was a clown in one of the Jewish circuses in Warsaw. And I was like, that is amazing, because you don't have to be a lawyer or a doctor, you can be a clown, yeah, and that's great. And the fascinating thing was, when I thought about what he said he was a clown in one of the Jewish circuses in Warsaw. What does that mean? There was more than one, because there's a Jewish circus that you go to and a Jewish circus that you don't go to. That is the nature of the place, that it is so like normal and metropolitan and cultured and interesting and different. There is a space for your child when they want to be a clown to grow up and like get a good job being a clown. And there's also the same machloket and all sorts of boigas that we're familiar with in our lives. And I think that once you start to see the story of Warsaw and the story of the Shoah as a story of clowns as well as rabbis, then it gives you some of that tapestry. And if we sort of fast forward into the war, I'm not trying to do the history of the Holocaust as a whole, but as we know, 1939, 1st of September, everything changes. Germany invades Poland with all of its racial theory and what it wants to achieve in Europe. And the Germans walk into Poland, and bear in mind that when they walk in there, their exposure to Jews, especially like the Hasidic Jews back in Germany, where Jews are like half of 1%, was pretty insignificant. They walk into Poland, which is the heartland of Jewish Europe, and that is where there are Hasidim there. There are people who look like, in their mind, like proper Jews. That's a great source of excitement for them. And this one picture in particular is the trains with soldiers that leave Germany, on which they've written that we're off to Poland in order to batter the Jews. Okay, so it's an invasion, but the Jewish story from the very beginning, from day one, is tied into what Germany want when they walk in there. Now, does that mean that the whole thing is mapped out and everybody knows exactly where it's going to go and there's a plan for the next 5 years? No, it doesn't work like the world doesn't work like that. We know that. But it means that it's the undercurrent to, I would say, everything that happens. And sometimes when it comes to like studying about the Holocaust, learning about the Holocaust, we sort of fast forward from this point and ask ourselves, okay, so when did they kill the Jews, type of thing? Like when does that happen? Because especially when you sit down with a survivor, sometimes you give them like 1 hour and you're like, tell me the really interesting bits. Don't tell me the sort of the day-by-day things. So what I want to do is I want to actually take a moment together to look at this idea of what happens before the Warsaw Ghetto, this concept that we know about happens. So I'm going to hand, someone's going to help me. You hand out, these are like one between 2 or 3. I'll take that and send these on the other side. And what you're seeing here are a list of anti-Jewish decrees. Because the Germans walk in, they take over, and they decree things against the Jews of Poland. You can see these are decrees from 1939 and from 1940. Because it's November of 1940 by the time the Warsaw Ghetto is closed. So that means that the Jews of Warsaw pretty much are spending a year under German occupation where everything is going to change. So what I want you to do is, with the person or the people next to you, have a quick read through them, and I want to ask you one question, and somebody's going to have to put up their hand and maybe try and answer, which is the questions written at the bottom. Which of these changes, are there any more sheets? You might have to share a little more, be a bit more sociable. Which of these changes was the most significant for the Jews of Warsaw? What had the biggest impact on their lives? And when you've thought of that, like, what ways would this thing impact on somebody's life? Okay, if you've not got a sheet at the back, there's one more. Okay, you've got 2 minutes among yourselves. People at the back have not got anything. Can you read those? Okay, I'm going to read them out for the people who have not got. 1939, October the 12th, Jews could not withdraw deposits, securities, cash or gold from banks, and limited to withdrawals of 200 zlotys a week, and the family can't possess more than 2,000 zlotys in cash. October 22nd, they may not own radios or enter movie theatres. Jewish teachers may not teach in Polish schools. November 17th, curfew imposed on all Jews from 5 o'clock. December the 1st, Jews made age of 10 must wear an armband with a blue Star of David. The Star of David must be pasted on Jewish stores. December the 3rd, they may not enter the central post office. December the 5th, all Jewish educational and schools and educational institutions are closed. And 22nd, 23rd of December, they may not use Polish porters, may not own telephones, and they must declare on a register all of their property. Okay, so that's 1939. So those of you who don't have, I apologize, there were no internet sheets. I was a pessimist. You can discuss it. Just take 1 minute amongst yourself. If anybody's willing to identify which of these are what we think would be the most significant. Okay, I'm going to bring everyone together. Anyone want to raise their hand and say which of these things? Yes.
The first one, money.
Money. Okay, not being able to hold the money. Why?
Because you don't have money, you can't buy money tickets to the theater, and you can't get on a train, and you can't do all the other stuff that go to private Jewish schools, which cost money. So you're kind of locked down. Okay, so the fear of not having the money, even if you used to have money, the idea that you can't hold a certain amount in your home, the implications of that. Anyone else?
School,
go on.
It's just you kill education, you kill tradition, you kill Jewish life in general. It's not, money comes and goes all the time. It's very important. Okay? But once you kill the Jewish values that come to school, and the parents will drive nuts.
Okay, I actually think the second point that you say is almost more important, and we are so much more attuned to some of these things today than we might have been 5 years ago. Like the implication of having no school, all of the knock-on effects of having your children at home and children being at home, and etc., etc., etc. So school is definitely a big thing. Anyone else?
Synagogues.
Sorry, go on. Okay, why would you say, what specifically about that?
Because everything else applies to you once they sit around there.
Right. Okay. Okay, so the marker of being marked out as a Jew means that all of the other things sort of are then suddenly on you. Any idea that you could escape? And bear in mind, again, the experience for different people is going to be different at that start, because some of us are used to walking around with our Judaism like on show, but there are many people who end up in Warsaw having to put on the star who would never have been a card-carrying Jew in any shape or form, and all of a sudden they're marked out as a group they probably don't want to be a part of. Okay, anyone else? Take one more. Yeah.
I saw the telephone one. I thought that you can't communicate. That's a huge isolation.
Well, that's who that from.
Yeah, right. Yeah, my people.
Yeah, I think people did, and even the access to a phone, the concept of sort of communication, and it's, remember, communication is being cut off in other ways as well. You can't go into the post office, you can't mail a letter. All of a sudden, you exist only in your own space. Again, something that we probably can't relate to at all. So the reason that I bring this is because, and there's no right or wrong answer of like what's the worst, because on October the 22nd, whatever's happening then is the worst. Because no one's thinking, well, you know what, on November the 1st, like something else is going to happen, and in a year's time, something else is going to happen, and who cares about all of this? Because in 3 years' time, there's going to be a place called Auschwitz. Like, the world doesn't work like that. We live in our moments, and we suffer in our moments. So to try and sort of like transpose backwards and say, well, it's only the post office being closed, that at its moment in time is the worst thing. And what you're seeing here is that the descent of the Jews in Warsaw in particular, it slides. It slowly like grinds away at who they are and what they have and what they can do. But that's also going to play into this character and of the Rebbe of Piasetzna, which is that in the same way that things change gradually, people also hold on to the things that are normal as much as they can. Okay, that's why he's going to be teaching in the ghetto, because no one's made an announcement that says like, don't bother anymore with any of your spirituality. Yeah, people, when everything else falls away, those small things that they're used to, that they can hold on to, become even more important. And here you can see that the ghetto closes in November of 1940, and all of a sudden the Jews physically then have to be in a certain space. Remember, everything that you saw before here, saw on your piece of paper, was before there was a ghetto. Yeah, they could not necessarily always travel freely, but no one knows sort of exactly where it's going. Come Yom Kippur of 1940, when the announcement is made that the gates are going to be closed, that the wall is going to be built, the wall, by the way, paid for by the Jews themselves, is going to encircle them, and everything really is going to change from then, because the potential of going anywhere, that disconnect with the world outside is going to disappear. And just a description in German terms of what a ghetto does, this is referring to Lodz. But the creation of the ghetto, says Friedrich Ubler, who was the president of that region, is of course only a transition measure. I shall determine at what time and what means the ghetto, and thereby also the city of Lodz will be cleansed of Jews. The final goal in any case must be that we burn out this plague poison. Okay, it's a temporary measure. It's they know that there's a bigger problem and it's going to have to be solved, and they're going to sort of temporarily hold everyone in this area of the ghetto, however long it takes. And bear in mind, don't imagine that ghettos are just Warsaw and Lodz and Krakow. There's over 1,000 ghettos across German-occupied Europe during the course of the war. Some of them last for a month, some of them, as the Lodz ghetto, last for many years. And just visually, this picture for me is important. We talk about like the wall of what it means to be in a ghetto. We normally think of it being entirely closed off. But if you look here, you can see that actually there are multi-story buildings. Now, the wall of the ghetto is not multi-story high, which means that if you're in the second floor, you can see out. You can see to the street, you can see the trams, you can see normal life going on the outside. So you've got this sort of like destruction going on the inside, but you can smell the bread that's being baked on the other side. You can hear the sports games that are happening in the sports field right next to the ghetto. So people at any stage are not entirely removed from the world. In fact, it's even worse because you can see it just over there. And just a couple of figures to give a context of what we're talking about. We talk about the ghetto, and sometimes numbers are important. We're talking about 1940 to 1943. We're talking about close to 500,000 Jews inside the Warsaw ghetto. there were about 330,000 Jews in Warsaw beforehand. Jews in towns and shtetl and villages around were also sent into the ghetto. You're talking about 9 people per room, not per building, not per house, per room. And that is often made up of various members of different families. If you don't have 9 people in your family, you're going to be put together. And it's 2.8% of the landmass of Warsaw, which means about half of the population of Warsaw is in less than 3% of the space. Okay, that's going to explain the 9 people to the room, and that's going to explain this, which is that close to 100,000 perish within the ghetto. Okay, that's starvation, that's disease, all of those testimonies, the pictures that you've probably seen before anyone comes up with the idea of an extermination camp, just like what they call like natural wastage is what the Germans called it. And those are the circumstances. That's like Warsaw or the Warsaw ghetto sort of in 5 minutes. And what I want to really touch on is like, how do we know so much about Warsaw? Like, if the Warsaw ghetto was destroyed come 1943, the uprising was like a drawn out destruction, liquidation of the ghetto. It took a month, but by the time that was done, pretty much everyone was gone. The vast majority of Warsaw's Jews were exterminated in Treblinka. Of those who managed to survive, a handful, yeah, thousands, but in the context of 500,000 Jews, that's absolutely nothing. The survival rate of Polish Jews is about 1 in 10. Yeah, so 3.3 million Jews, 3 million of whom were murdered. And that's sort of the story of Warsaw. So how do we know so much? How do we have the writings of the Kodesh? Now, Shachar touched on it, and it's all going to come down to this man. It's a man called Emanuel Ringelblum. Born in 1900. He was a historian, he was a politician, he was an activist. And I said this to Deborah the other day. They call Yom HaShoah, והגבורה in Israel, which I really don't like, because it implies that there's Shoah and there's Gebura, there's Holocaust and there's heroes, and the two aren't the same and they can't meet. So people who died are Holocausted, and people who like are heroic, they did something heroic, and you can't find someone in the wrong camp, so to speak. And I think it's a mistake, like what our heroes look like. And Emanuel Ringelblum very much, I would say, was one of the heroes of the Holocaust. They say like the pen is mightier than the sword. He was a writer. He was an intellectual. He was a doctor, and even before the war, he was telling the story of Poland's Jews. He was writing books about them. He was collecting a lot of social history, which at the time was this interesting thing. Like, let's not talk about wars and big things. Let's talk about like, how people live their lives. Like, what makes up society? What makes up communities? And he took the same person that he was from before the war. And when he finds himself inside the Warsaw ghetto, he does exactly the same thing. He has a job as part of together with the joints, like money that's being sent from America in order to support the Jews of Europe, and all of the various like soup kitchens and self-help and these types of things that are happening inside the ghetto, where even though people have got nothing, they're still trying to take care of one another. Emanuel Ringelblum is involved in that, and he comes up with this concept that he calls the Onyx Shabbat. Okay, the Onyx Shabbat. Why is it called the Onyx Shabbat? Because this group of people used to meet on a Friday night. Him and his intellectual friends and his people that he wanted to hang out with, not just to hang out, but to say there is a story that is being told here. There is stuff that's happening here in Warsaw that we need to record, that we need to write down, in the same way that we were writing it down 10 years ago. And he creates a network of people who, in secret, go around and start documenting and cataloging what's going on. And it happens, I would say, in 2 ways. One thing that they do is literally collect stuff. Okay, posters that are on the wall that the Germans have written. Yeah, newspapers, any types of bits of art that are done, personal account bits of testimony, all of those things are being collected. They have an entire network of scribes, of people who are copying down things in duplicate and in triplicate in order that they can be sort of recorded and catalogued. But then he also manages to find all these interesting intellectuals. And he says, I'm going to pay you to be on the payroll of the self-help. And you're going to have a job, but your real job is to write down what's going on. Your real job is to study the people, to study the experiences. And he has a sense, and the sense develops during the course of the war, that what is happening here is world changing. And it might become, and this is so that a realization I would say later in the war, it might become that there is no one in order to tell, there's not going to be anyone around to tell anyone what we've seen. Therefore, even more so, we need to start cataloging, we need to start writing it down. And some of the studies that they do are like, again, light years ahead of their time. One of the women that he sends off is to do the study of the experience of women inside the ghetto. Okay, like they're thinking about like how different groups are experiencing all of these things. A woman called Raquel, he says like, where are you really going to hear like what's going on the street? In the kitchens. He says he sends her in to work inside one of the soup kitchens because then you meet all of the people. That's when they tell you their stories. That's when they tell you what's going on. The people that are working in the kitchen, they know that this one needs this one needs that, and they write down absolutely everything about it. And towards the end of the period of the Warsaw Ghetto, these things, when it becomes very clear that the liquidation is happening, they rush to pack these things into metal boxes and into metal milk cans, and they get buried. There are 4 sections of this archive that get buried. The archive itself is well over 25,000 documents and pieces of paper, which pretty much tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. Of the people who were in, so I would say, the inner circle, the 30 or so of the inner circle of the Onyx Shabbat, 2 of them survived. And one of those was one of the only 3 people, I think, if I'm not mistaken, who knew the location of the archives. Which means that if we see here, you can see this is exactly what Rav Shachar was describing. This is in the first one's found in 1946. Okay, September 1946, on, what was it? Novolipki Street, I think, in Warsaw, that they dig under the rubble and they find these 10 boxes, and they stand there and they start to unpack them, and then it's immediate, but these things have decayed already, and they start to like sort of pull them apart in order to testify for what's going on, because one of the things that we're used to is we're used to hearing the story of the Holocaust by people who survived. We very rarely hear it from the people who actually perished. Their voice is literally extinguished. So what this archive is their voice. Then a number of years later, in 1956, there's another chunk of it that's found in these milk cans, which was in much better condition, and there's still a piece missing. One of the 4 sections of the archive, they reckon it's somewhere under the Chinese embassy in Warsaw to this day. No one's managed to find it. There have been various attempts, and that's really, if you go back to that question asked at the beginning, which is like, how do we know about this? It's because of this archive, and it's a secret archive because the Jews of Warsaw didn't know what was happening. The people who were collecting information for the archive, most of them didn't know that the other one existed. And what I want to do is, for a few minutes, is just to share a few things that are in the archive, and then understand like 1 or 2 things about Ringelblum, and I think like why he was so important. This is a man called Avram Lewin, and this is December the 29th, 1942. Now, just in terms of where this fits in terms of the story of the ghetto, the great action in which 300,000 Jews from Warsaw were taken and murdered in Treblinka happened already. It happened between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur of 1942. So this is 3-4 months later, where only the Swedim, the last few, maybe 50,000 or so Jews are living inside the ghetto. And you hear from what he says, like what Warsaw was. Warsaw was in fact the backbone of Polish Jewry. Its heart, one could say. The destruction of Warsaw would have meant the destruction of the whole of Polish Jewry, even if the provinces had been spared this evil. Now that the enemy's sword of destruction has run amok through small towns and villages, and is cutting them down with murderous blows, with the death agony of the metropolis, the entire body is dying and plunging into hell. One can say that with the setting of the sun of Polish Jewry, the splendor and the glory of world Jewry has vanished. We, the Polish Jews, were, after all, the most vibrant nerve of our people. And it's not an arrogant thing to say. The Jews of Warsaw were. They were the beating heart of world Jewry. And the idea of that disappearing. Bear in mind, he doesn't know what's happened or what's going to happen to the rest of the Jews of Europe. He's conceiving that without Jews of Warsaw, the Jewish people are gone. Like the sun pretty much has set. All of that culture, all of those figures, and that belief that it couldn't exist without them. Now, this I want to share because, and this sort of touches on the religious part of the archive. Emanuel Ringelblum was very much not religious. He was a Marxist. He was part of the left coalition, and you could imagine that if he was writing his archive, the stories would be his stories. Yeah, these are the people. He had enough people who were on the same political and ideological page as him to say, this is who I'm gonna talk about. It was very important for him to tell the story of the whole Jewish people, and that's why the Eish Kodesh, that's why the Piatzetsna is going to be inside the archive, because he says, I can imagine Emmanuel Wingelblum would say, I don't want to go to a sermon by the Piatzetsna. Yeah, I don't want to go to a shir, but I think it's important that his shir exists and that someone is able to remember it in the same way they were able to remember something else. And he preserves a piece of writing by a man called Shai Perl. And you hear sort of the religious element here. It says, in the dark nights, I hear the great weeping of the mother of all mothers, our mother Rachel, Mama Rachel. She walks across the desolate fields and she wraps her children in burial sheets. With her beautiful, delicate hands, she washes the blood off her sons and daughters. But can she wrap all of them in burial sheets? Can she wash them all? Blood cries out. It's a reference to Eretz Alta Chasidamam, like the earth should not cover their blood. And the earth, in all its length and breadth, is dissolved in lamentation. Again, all of these words that we're familiar with. They lay the slaughtered creatures naked and chained, scattered and spread, impurified for burial, without a kaddish, without a gravestone, violated by the murderous hands of Amalek, with the consent of the Holy Congregation of Warsaw. So you see that he's bringing this into Jewish history as a whole. This isn't just 1939 to 1945. This goes all the way back to Amalek. And his very cutting last line tells you something else about this archive, which is that it pulls no punches, because there was conflict inside the Warsaw Ghetto. People didn't like the way that other people acted. People looked at the Jewish Council, for instance, and said, you know what, you're on the edge of being, you either are collaborators or you're on the edge of being collaborators. Yeah, you're consenting, some of them people said, to the Nazis, to the Germans coming in here and doing that. And Shai Perl says, if people are going to remember what's happening here, they have to know that there were other people, that there was blame to be cast. And sometimes that sort of shatters our things. So like, surely all of the victims of the Holocaust were the victims of the Holocaust, which they were. And don't get me wrong, we're not here, we don't come to judge Jewish victims of the Holocaust with the same yardstick as we talk about the criminals of the Holocaust. But the moral questions that they were being asked then as they would be asked today. And it's challenging sometimes to see just how complex their world was. And I want to fast forward for a moment to the Eish Kodesh himself. And if we sort of, I'll tell you one sort of like biographical note about the Eish Kodesh, which is that if you read his book, or that was posthumously published, back to the archive for a second, 6 years, I think, after the second lot of the archive was taken out, no one had found the writings of the Eish Kodesh. A man called Baruch Duvdevani goes back to Warsaw because he was connected to the whole like chevra there, and he goes back and tries to look. There's word that the writings still exist. And he goes to the Jewish Historical Institute where all the writings are, and they say there's nothing from the Rebbe here. Eventually he gives up. And literally just before he leaves, someone hands him a piece of paper and says, what about this? And he finds the last will and testament of the Rebbe of Piatzetsna. And in it, he says, I request, what's his last request? He's not got anything to leave to anyone. He says, here are my writings, the Hachshavat Avreichim, like his second book, Mavohashar, and like the names of his books. And he says, please, whoever finds this, exert themselves to send them to the land of Israel. And this following letter addressed to Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, his brother, in Tel Aviv, Palestine. When the Holy One, blessed be he, will show mercy, I and the remaining Jews may set, or if we survive the war, please return all the materials here to me in Warsaw, to the rabbinate, to Rabbi Kalonimus, and may God have mercy upon us, the remnant of Israel, etc., etc. And Baruch Duvdevani realizes that if that's here, then the rest of everything is here. And that's how he manages to pull out the writings, written, some of them in the hand of the Rebbe himself, some of them by his scribe. And you can see here one of those pages, and it gets transferred into a book. It's published, it's been republished and sort of organized many times. It's his drashot that he gave at Sudash Lishit. And I would say he's like renowned for his honesty, because you can imagine that sometimes you have to, you just like placate people type of thing. But right at the beginning of the war, the Rebbe becomes not a bystander, but becomes part of it, because September of 1939, his son is hit by shrapnel, and he takes his son to the hospital in Warsaw, and he's there with his daughter-in-law and his sister-in-law, and they're standing at the door of the hospital all night. The Rebbe then goes to go and, I think in the morning, he leaves them to go and get something, comes back. By the time he comes back, the hospital's been bombed. And his sister-in-law and his daughter-in-law have been killed. 4 days later, his son dies. So he loses, in the very beginning of the war, he loses three of the people closest to him. And if you open up the Kodesh today, you'll see that the drashot in 1939, they go to Yom Kippur, and then they're missing. There's nothing for Simchat Torah, there's nothing for Sukkot, there's nothing for Bereshit, Noach, Lech Lecha, Uvayera, silent. There's no drashot. And then Chayei Sarah comes around and there's a drasha. So you might turn around and say, listen, just a piece of paper missing. But when you read what he writes in Chayei Sarah, you realize that it's much more logical that he was just silent. Because there's avilut, like immediate avilut. And when he talks about Chayei Sarah, he says something amazing. He says that Rashi explains that the death of Sarah was it juxtaposed the binding of Yitzchak because her soul burst forth from her and she died. This idea that Sarah dies when she hears about Akedat Yitzchak. That is to say, Moshe, our teacher, the faithful shepherd, juxtaposed the death of Sarah to the binding of Yitzchak in order to advocate for us, indicating what results from excessive afflictions. It's wild what he says. He says, Moshe writes the Torah in a way that puts these two things together, what? As a warning to God that there is a limit to the suffering that people can take. If he hadn't said it, it's like it's very bold. And when you see it in the context of a man who is coming literally out of Shloshim and opening his mouth in front of his students for the first time, you see that it is saying, I'm here with you. I'm one of you. I might be the Rebbe, but I'm just part of the people. I'm part of Am Yisrael. I'm part of the people suffering in exactly the same way. And I think that when you come to read the book and to see what the students of the Rebbe found in him, it's that honesty. And I want to close with one piece about the Rebbe, which is this. Before the Rebbe put his writings inside the milk cans, or he passed them over to someone to pass them over to Ringelblum to go inside the milk cans, there were certain corrections and things that he added, and he also signed them. And one of the last pieces of paper that he signed has his signature looking like this. And it's strange, but it says Kalonimus Kalman Shapira, Ben, all the sort of letters, his father, Migroditz. Yeah, his father was the rabbi in Groditz. And then something crossed out. So he makes a mistake when he signs his name. Fair enough, like that's possible. And that was just one of the many scribbles that are on the documentation. In recent years, they've managed to take one of these like special magical cameras and to work out what was written underneath. And what was written underneath the scribbled marked here is Av Beit Din de Piatzetzna, the head of the Beit Din of Piatzetzna. And I don't know what order exactly everything happened, but at some point he wrote his name and he signed his name like he always did, which was Kalonimus Kalman Shapira, the Av Beit Din of Piatzetzna. But before he picks up these pieces of paper and he puts them inside the archive, he realizes that he's no longer the Av Beit Din of Piatzetzna, because there are no Jews of Piatzetzna. There are pretty much no Hasidim. He really doesn't have anybody. So in the interest of Emet, in the interest of truth, he crosses it out and he just puts himself as who he is. Because at the end of the day, that's all he's got left. And I think with that, you see, again, different types of heroes. People who said, I'm going to hold on to who it is that I am doing the same thing. I really hope that that's been a helpful insight into Warsaw, into the character. I can promise you one thing, that when you take the book home and you read I think chapter is section B or section 2 of the book that tells you about the memories of the Rebbe himself, you'll get a much better sense of this person. But thanks to Emanuel Ringelblum, who turns around and says, not everyone needs to be like me. I'm willing to save something that belongs to someone else and someone else's worldview. Thankfully, we have the writings of the Piatzetzna, and that's a part of what we can study today. And hopefully that's something going forward. The idea that these things are being studied here in the land of Israel is a zchut and something that Rosh Shachar is a part of continuing part of the legacy. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll hand over.
Thank you. My grandfather, stayed the Av Beit Din of Piatzetzna. And if it's for my grandfather, so it's our duty. Thank you very much, Zach, for your unique and valuable insight. One thing that, other thing that Zach said, Sada and many other Holocaust survivors did not like Holocaust Remembrance Days being on the 27th of Nisan, the Kafzayin Nisan, because it was chosen in the context of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Mered Ghetto Warsaw, and does not highlight the true heroism of the Holocaust. Sada saw great importance in remembering and documenting the Holocaust, but what he wants us to remember most is the heroism of preserving Judaism and heroism of the Jewish spirit. I would like to invite Rabbi David Fine, a lecturer on behalf of the Shem Olam Institute, which stress documentation of the Holocaust, not only as a memorial, but also as a key factor in defining our values, spirits, and faith. And let me take this opportunity to say thank you to the Rabbi Fine for coming 2 days after the birth of your first grandson. There is nothing that represents continuity better and with more joy than the birth of child during the week of the Yom Shoah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rav Shaka. Zach, that was amazing. And if you want to hear more of Zach, you could go to Poland with him. He's there only once a month. So go to jroots.com, right? Or okay. Just two things I want to say before I start speaking, and that is number one, I did get a message from Rav Sobel during the talk that he is not going to be able to make it, but he sends his brachot and he wishes, he apologizes he can't be here, and that is number one. And number two is that something that some people may not know is that one of the things Barkai did, especially during Corona, was make matches between synagogues in Israel and synagogues in around the world, mostly in the United States, to do things on Zoom together during Corona, and hopefully following Corona, people would be able to meet in person through trips to Israel. So there was a match made between Rav Shakar's congregation and Camp Mill Synagogue in Maryland, and we did one event together through Zoom on Tisha B'Av, and there are several reasons why this is being broadcast on Zoom, but one of them is to give the people there in Maryland the chance to hear us as well. On that note, in Shemot, Parak Bet, Pasuk Yud, we learn of the naming of Moshe by Bat Paro. Vayigdal hayeled, v'tivyehu levat Paro, vayila leben, v'tikra shmo Moshe, v'tomer kinyan hamayim mishitiru. Sforno comments on the name Moshe, who was called that because he was drawn out of the water. But the name reflects something active, to draw rather than to be drawn. Sforno notes that the name also reflects his future actions, not only his past actions. That just as he was saved, he too will save others. Holocaust survivors are not just remembered for the suffering that they went through during a horrific time, but for carrying on the legacy of the Jewish people after their survival. They were saved, but their legacy is defined by the fact that they also saved future generations. I start this way because I think that Rav Yisrael Yitzchakim, the last Chassid, the subject of this wonderful book of Rav Shaka, is an example of just such a person. Someone who not only saved himself, using his great faith to give him much of the fortitude he needed to survive, but he saved us as well. Without people like him, we, the Jewish people, would not be here today. The topic given to me by Rav Shachar on memory and testimony is a monumental topic upon which thousands of books literally have been written and many conferences have been held. I could take this in many ways, including some very academic and technical. I would just like to make a few almost random reflections on the topic, using Rav Shachar's book as the basis in a way that we will find it meaningful and that will make our lives more ethical, more productive, more faithful, and more religious. I think that that is what Rav Keen would have wanted. Survivor Tzvi Gil, the first of the 6 torchlighters from last night's ceremony at Yad Vashem, for those who saw it, spoke at a conference called the Conference on the Legacy of Holocaust Survivors at Yad Vashem in 2002. And during his closing remarks to the conference, he said the following: in Jewish tradition, the command to remember is absolute, but its obligation does not end with cognitive act of memory. It must be connected to both meaning and action. Today, we for whom the memory is burned in our hearts and on our flesh, gather to pass the torch of memory to the next generation. We pass to you as well the fundamental lesson of Judaism, that memory must be accompanied by action of ethical and moral intent. This must be the foundation and the focus of your energies toward the creation of a better world. According to an article I recently came across entitled "Using Testimony in Holocaust Education," the role of survivors' testimonies in Holocaust remembrance and education is crucial for 2 main reasons. I actually think that it is crucial for more than 2 main reasons. But what are the 2 reasons that this article gives? Number 1, the Nazis regarded Jews not as human beings, but as parasites that had to be completely exterminated. Therefore, they set the goal for themselves of eliminating every Jew on whom they could lay hands and obliterating all evidence of their crimes. Given this intent, the fact that the surviving Jews were able to speak of what happened, recount those who did not survive, and tell their human experience is of great power and importance. And number 2, speaking about the Holocaust entails dealing with numbers. If people are to gain historical knowledge and understanding of the event, they need to know that approximately 6 million Jews were murdered. If they wish to understand the inhuman conditions in the Warsaw ghetto, for instance, of which we just heard about, they ought to know that the daily food ration that the Germans allocated to each resident of the ghetto provided 184 calories of nutrition. However, since the Holocaust was a series of atrocities inflicted by people on people and a matter of great moral and ethical significance, it is crucial that the human experience of the victims be told in the first person so that it may at least partly be understood. I raise this issue of testimony not only because it was part of the title that was given to me, but because unfortunately what passes for much of Holocaust education and research today is only about numbers, dates, statistics, etc. Don't get me wrong, it is critically important and essential to know the daily ration of food in the ghetto. How many Jews were murdered in Treblinka? What was the method of murder in Majdanek? And how many Jews lived in Warsaw before the war? You can't move 2 meters in Holocaust research, education, or understanding without knowing all of these statistics and dates, etc. But this is only the context, not the text. In much of the world, the context has become the text. The text is and should be the human element, the moral and ethical element, the religious and the spiritual element. This is how I was trained to study the Holocaust, both in my graduate studies in the United States and in the Poland guide course that I took at the Shem Olam Institute in Far that Zach also took 9 years before me, I guess. The full name of the institute is Shem Olam, Faith and the Holocaust, Institute for Education, Documentation, and Research. Well named. Its purpose, as stated on its website, is suffering, killing, starvation, hatred, destroying the human image, annihilation are synonymous with the Holocaust. But the Holocaust is also coping, values, preservation of the human image, spirit, faith. These new angles are the key to a deep understanding of what happened in the ghettos and camps, in hiding and in struggle. Through this field, Jewish history will be reflected in the decades and centuries to come. This field is not only a memory, but also a constitutive factor for identifying values, spirit, and faith. In the last decade since the Holocaust, there has been a great lack in the world of scientific research and educational studies on this topic. Therefore, the Shem Olam Institute has harnessed itself and others to carry out research using historical scientific tools while uncovering documents and unfamiliar sources relating to the world of values, faith, religious, and spiritual life, which focus attention on coping in the Holocaust. Shem Olam is harnessing its research to the field of education with accent on the unearthly reality of a vast portion of Jews living in darkness and the shadow of death in a world surrounded by inhumanity. I mention all of this not as an advertisement for Shem Olam, but rather because this is really the essence of Rav Shafar's book. Just read the special introduction to the English version. I quote, "The purpose of the translation is twofold, both to depict the historical reality of the Holocaust and what happened then in the most authentic way, and to depict the strength and spirit that exists within man and which keeps him going during life's darkest hours." I would like to speak about two terms that are somewhat related, but not totally. The first is called spiritual coping, and the second is spiritual resistance. Both of these terms are not strictly Jewish terms, but obviously they both were developed following the Holocaust. These are the two terms that jumped out at me as I read through this book. I want to talk about spiritual coping first. Spiritual coping or religious coping is the use of religious beliefs, attitudes, or practices to reduce the emotional distress caused by the stressful events of life, such as loss or change, which gives suffering meaning and makes it more bearable. In an important article in a journal called Holocaust Studies, a journal of culture and history, in volume 2019, autumn of 2013, entitled, "I was holding on to my ancestral merit, religious coping on the Holocaust in the light of Hasidic tales of survival," psychologists Karolina Kerzinska and Joseph Korvalin discuss Yafa Eliak's Hasidic tales of the Holocaust. They conclude that in a situation of extreme trauma, deprivation, and absence of other methods of self-defense, deeply internalized religiosity based upon allegiance to a tzaddik and strict adherence to everyday religious practice, as well as close kinship and family allegiances, became a powerful method of coping and survival. The religious coping framework allowed identification of a wide and diverse range of positive religious coping mechanisms, which helped highly religious individuals confronted with the inexplicable, the irresolvable, and the limits of their word to survive. While reading or listening to this type of research, it makes it seem that the individual does this in order to survive, but it is exactly the opposite that is true. The person is able to survive because of their great spiritual fortitude. This idea is on almost every page of this book. Halacha, Torah, Yiddishkeit, morality, humanism are at the very core of Rav Yisrael Yitzchak Khan. I would like to read you just one example, which is short but very telling. I call it religious imagination or religious memory. It is the kli, the vessel that Rav Khan used to escape the terror that he was living through. I read from page 198. The festival of Sukkot arrived. In my imagination, I walked alongside my deceased father, heading to shul with our Arba Minim. It was so wonderful to shake the lulav as we recited the Hallel, as the Chazan called out. I should just give us a little context. This is in Auschwitz. Thank the Lord, since he is good, since his kindness is forever. Let Israel now say, thank the Lord, since he is good, since his kindness is forever. Let the house of Aaron now say, thank the Lord, since he is good, since his kindness is forever. Let those who fear the Lord now say, thank the Lord, since he is good, since his kindness is forever. This is obviously from Hallel. This is him thinking in Auschwitz. I envision the shul packed with people and the scent of the etrog, the fruit of the citrus tree wafting through the air. I remember the special holiday meal that my mother would prepare and how we would sit in the sukkah basking in the shade of the divine presence. 7 days when my father spent all this time in the sukkah, in this tremendous mitzvah that envelops a person's entire being. This is only one of the 613 mitzvot that we fulfill. This is the only one of the 613 mitzvot that we fulfill with our entire bodies. Eating and spending time in the sukkah, learning Torah in it, and sleeping in it always brought a special atmosphere into our home throughout the 7-day long holiday. I was filled with great sorrow at the realization that this was my third Sukkot without my father, and the first Sukkot far from all my relatives and community, without any festive foods, without the Arba Minim, and without a sukkah. I mourn the loss of these precious mitzvot, but I understood that this was God's will at this time. I'm going to stop reading now, but it goes on to describe how he and a group of people actually built a sukkah in Auschwitz. Page 199, if you'd like to read it on your own. There are many similar examples of this in the book. Rav King uses his memory to imagine better times, which enables him not only to cope, but to actually further his relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, despite the trying times. Next, let us turn to spiritual resistance. Spiritual resistance has many definitions in the academic literature. Just to give you one of them from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the definite spiritual resistance refers to attempts by individuals to maintain their humanity, personal integrity, dignity, and the sense of civilization in the face of Nazi attempts to dehumanize and degrade them. Most generally, spiritual resistance may refer to the refusal to have one's spirit broken in the midst of the most horrible degradation. Cultural and spirit and educational activities, maintenance of community documentation, and clandestine religious observances are 3 examples of spiritual resistance. I would just add to that definition that, I would just add that in many cases, as with Rabbi Yisrael Yitzhak, it was not primarily an attempt to maintain humanity, personal integrity, dignity of sense of civilization, but rather, or in addition to, maintaining their status as an Eved Hashem. I believe that one of the greatest examples of spiritual resistance by Rabbi Yisrael Yitzhak and those that were with him in Gross Rosen, just one of the camps he was in, is the following story that's told on page 213. This is a very powerful story. It's a little long, but I think it's worth reading. I lay on the plank. I'll start here. Nighttime was calm and quiet in the labor camp after another day of difficult back-breaking work. Sometimes it seemed that the day would go on forever and never end. But the world kept going, the sun set, the moon glimmered, a bird twittered, a flower bloomed, a rifle was shot, a dog barked, a person was killed, and another one, and another one, and another one. I lay on the plank in the barracks, attempting to fall asleep after an exhausting day of work. Many thoughts sprung up and crossed my mind, thoughts that would not let me rest. What happened to my family? Where are they now? Will I ever be able to see them again? Amidst these thoughts, I slipped into a deep sleep. Psst, psst. A strange hissing sound emanated from one of the planks. Psst, psst. I have tefillin, the voice said. Shifting and whispering noises began to fill the entire barracks. Tefillin, how? Who brought tefillin to this place? How dangerous? Good job. Who is this Jew? Is this real? Maybe he's lying. Maybe he just wants to inform on us to the Nazis. Within minutes, all of the Jews in the barracks gathered around a dignified-looking Jew who was actually holding in his hands a genuine pair of tefillin. Tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. I was a rabbi in Hungary before the war. The Jew began to explain. I never thought that a Jew wouldn't be able to put on tefillin if he wanted to. But now this war has proven that even for a simple mitzvah like this, we must risk our lives in order to be able to perform it. The Jews in the barracks stirred around him excitedly and listened attentively to his story as he related how he managed to smuggle the tefillin into the camp in exchange for a large sum of bribe money, also that we would be able to put on tefillin after almost 2 years of not being able to fulfill this important mitzvah. When the rabbi finished his story, a halachic discussion began among the Jews of the barracks. It was nighttime, and at night, we do not put on tefillin. So according to Jewish law, a blessing can only be recited when the tefillin are put on at the first light of sunrise, Eitz HaChama, or non-ideally a bit earlier from dawn, from Alon HaShachar. I stood at the side and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Jews, gaunt, degraded down to the dirt, who had not put tefillin on their heads for almost 2 years, who know very well how severe it is to not put on tefillin, as the Gemara says, a head that has not done tefillin. Finally see a pair of tefillin in front of their eyes and beginning to deliberate and discuss whether it is permissible to put tefillin on at night or not. On one hand, I was very happy to see that Jews still remembered how to learn Torah and how the halacha is decided, and that they wanted to fulfill God's true will. But on the other hand, the soul was missing from me. The excitement that had been in the air just a few minutes earlier when this Jew called to all of us and told us he had tefillin in his hands, where had it disappeared to? I decided to take action. I entered the circle of deliberating Jews and announced out loud, when I go up to heaven, I want to be among those souls who the angel comes and strikes for putting on tefillin at night with a blessing. In the midst of the terrible war days, after not putting on tefillin for almost 2 full years. I do not want to be among those who didn't put on tefillin after they had such a golden opportunity such as this. Without thinking twice, I grabbed the tefillin from the hands of one of the deliberating men and recited the blessing fervently. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to put on tefillin. I put the tefillin shel yad on the muscle of my left arm. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the mitzvah of tefillin. I recited the next blessing and put the tefillin shel rosh at the front of my forehead, where the hair begins to grow. Silence fell over the barracks. All of the Jews stood in shock and watched me. A few seconds later, all of the Jews were standing in 2 lines and putting on the tefillin with the blessing, despite the halakha deliberations about putting them on at night. My heart filled with joy. I'm going to stop here, although it's difficult. The story goes on for a few more pages, describing how the tefillin were actually confiscated by the commandant and Rav Keen sneaking into the commandant's office with a fake pair of tefillin that were crafted by somebody else in the camp and replaced with the fake pair of tefillin, and the real pair of tefillin saved. But I urge you to continue reading. I want to end with one other requirement of memory, and especially testimony, and that is what we would call authenticity. In order for testimony to be truly useful, it must be authentic. It cannot be hagiographical. Hagiographical means the study of saints, meaning a book which only praises without sharing any of the negative aspects of someone's personality. It must be biographical, not hagiographical, and show the subject as a real person with real doubts. I don't believe that anyone could have lived through the real hell that Rabbi Yisrael Yitzhak lived through without doubt, uncertainty, and without at some point just wanting to give up, no matter the strength of one's religious convictions. So I want to end with just one more selection showing the authenticity of this book. It's called Mounting Despair on page 229. Shortly after the unthinkable crime of stealing a bit of oil from the kitchen, I was transferred to the adjacent camp, Waldenburg. The primary labor at the camp, was digging large pits in that same dreadful mud called lime that I had already encountered at Kultwasser. The work was immensely difficult. Those wooden shoes had stuck to the mud and made it difficult to walk, and the heavy shovels that made it almost impossible to dig caused me to feel despondent, and my suffering was too heavy to bear. A few days later, I felt for the first time that I was depressed. It was clear to me that my end was near, and all I wanted was to ease my suffering. On the 19th of Kislev 5705, corresponding to December 5th, 1944, I gave up, surrendered, and asked to go to the U room. Its full name was the Unfit, which means unfit for work. And this was where anyone who could not work any longer was thrown. Every few days, a large vehicle would stop at the entrance to the room, and exactly 50 people would be loaded into it. The vehicle would then drive to the main Gross Rosen camp, from which no one ever returned. When I arrived at the entrance of the room, the Jewish physician who was responsible for the room came to examine me. The doctor looked at me for a long time, scanning me from head to toe, and said resolutely, "You don't belong here. You can still work." "I do not want to work anymore. I have no more energy," I answered in despair, entering the terrible room. "What do you think you're doing? This is not the place for you," the doctor said angrily. "Go back to work. You don't need to die." But I continued into the room, ignoring his words. The letter U was printed largely on my body, and it was final. I was part of the room that would be sent in just a few days' time to the unknown. "Yisrael, what are you doing here?" One of the Jews in the room suddenly called out to me. "It's me, Asher Lindner." "Asher," I cried out joyfully, "what are you doing here?" I asked. Asher was my cousin, and I had not seen him for a very long time. "I have no more strength. The depression from this horrendous war has brought me to this room," Asher said to me with terrible sorrow. I, who was in the exact same situation, listened to his despair and his sorrow, and I completely identified with his feelings. Thus, we lay alongside each other that entire night, very fearful about what the future would bring, but completely understanding that we couldn't take the cruel reality of our daily lives any longer, the hunger, the labor, and the terrible degradation. Again, I'll stop here. Obviously, that's not the way it ends. And thankfully, that's not the way it ends. And for the way it ends, please buy this wonderful book. I started with quoting the Sforno on the birth of Moshe, and on his name. Not only was he himself saved, but he worked very hard to save future generations. So I think that the last Hasid and others like him really fought. They coped spiritually, they resisted spiritually, and they, in many ways, as I said before, became even better Jews during this terrible, terrible time in our history. And because they did that, they, in essence, as I said at the beginning, saved us. So may all their memories be for blessing. May we take the model of not only the last Hasid, but others like him, and use that as a model for our own religious growth as we move on into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our time, it was powerful. There is all powerful.
Thank you.
And they will say some words I didn't read it before, but I find actually they said in English reality. Live the stories. And thank you to Sarah McGuire for the great translate. It's the first time I can hear it. Someone else, not to read it, actually hear it, how much it sounds powerful in English. I hope indeed that we take the heart what we have learned and add another important layer to the memory and documentation of the Holocaust for future generations. And thank you all so much. And may hear only bשורות טובות for us and for all of Israel. שיהיו בשורות טובות לנו, לכל ישראל, בעזרת השם. And like I opened, כמו שפתחתי, good evening, we can say good evening because all of us here in the Israeli country, free country, מדינת ישראל, אז שיהיה לכולנו ערב טוב.